Okay, everyone. My name is Brett Labello. I'm the Director of Regional History and Genealogy at Pikes Peak Library District. We'll get started right now. I know that people are still trickling in, but we do have a timetable to keep. The goal today is to have everything done by noon Mountain Time, and that will include 4 speakers and a 15-minute break right around 10:45. Okay, so to stay on track, we'll get started right now. And as people can still filter in, they'll hopefully haven't missed too much because I will do a little bit of welcoming and thank yous and whatnot. So we'll go ahead. Pikes Peak Library District is a nationally recognized system of public libraries serving El Paso County, Colorado. With 15 facilities, online resources, and a mobile library service, PPLD responds to the unique needs of our individual neighborhoods and community at large here in El Paso County. Over the past couple of years, our team at the library has illustrated today's theme of resilience, resistance, and restoration in how we've adapted and succeeded throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the library also possesses a long track record as a repository for our region's history. History saved and preserved is the foundation for our future generations here in our community and our region. By preserving authentic and meaningful documents, images, and stories, future generations have that foundation on which to build and know what it means to be a member of our community. History builds community. As a part of that community, we have this very special program today, and any event like this is the product of many efforts, and I'd like to recognize a couple of folks. First of all, we have some great sponsors. Our sponsors of this event are Colorado Humanities Council, Helen and James McCaffrey Fund for Regional History, the Friends of the Pikes Peak Library District, and the Pikes Peak Library District Foundation. We also have some great partners. Our partners include Pikes Peak Community College, Pikes Peak Genealogical Society, the Western Museum of Mining and Industry, and the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank a couple specific individuals. I know that last time we had the in-person presentations at East Library. This one is a little bit stripped down and at the virtual element a little bit more simple, but we definitely couldn't do this without communications, our communications team in promoting our event, and the regional history and genealogy team here at Penrose Library and Special Collections. They're actually still working. The doors are open here at Special Collections, and we are serving the public as we speak. I'd also like to thank former staff member Chris Nickel, who was instrumental in creating the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium. And she has since retired, but she has ably passed on that baton and all of her 19 years of fantastic work to Kara Ramsey, who is our program coordinator. She's the person behind the scenes making sure everything moves smoothly. So I'd like to thank both Chris and Kara. Like I said, the whole premise today is we will have 2 speakers right off the bat and another 2 speakers after a break. That break should be about 10:45 to 11 o'clock. And we will, at the very end, have a Q&A when we bring all the panelists back together. If you do have questions, put them into chat or put them into the Q&A, and I will bring those back to the whole group and have them unmute and answer those questions at the very end of our sessions today. Okay, on that note, I know you'll enjoy the great slate of speakers that we have scheduled this morning. And our first speaker today is Katherine Scott Sturdevant. She is the senior professor of history at Pikes Peak Community College. She has participated in the many PPLD symposium and contributed to most of the resulting regional history series publications since their inception. As a published writer and professional editor, Kathy brings to projects a sense of humor, human interest, and approaches of social, public, and community, family, and political history, as well as literary expertise. She frequently speaks or consults locally and nationally. Her presentation today is titled Sanitarium City Meets COVID, Colorado Springs as a crisis community. Kathy, take it away.
Thank you, Brett. I hope everyone can hear me. This is definitely a work in progress, as you might be able to tell by the topic. Unfortunately, it's a topic in progress. And I think that Colorado Springs really lends itself to studying how we do COVID or have done COVID here in comparison to not only other places, but also how we've handled other diseases. For good or ill, pun intended, Colorado Springs is founded as, to a large extent, a place intended to be healthy for people. And all the more so, the more it became a marketable opportunity to claim to be particularly healthy for people. So as you see me go through this, you're seeing a rough draft of a first stage of making comparisons and parallels between Colorado Springs and really Colorado altogether as a place of health and well-being, sold that way and trying to maintain that, along with how that influences or maybe just parallels and keeps the same all the experiences of COVID in America or the world. One of the first things you see on my slide is that one of the nicknames for Colorado Springs was Sanitarium City, as though this was the headquarters of all of those places intended to help people get over the scourge of the day, which in reference to that was tuberculosis. And so we're looking at one unfortunate epidemic after another in American history. We're looking at them socially and economically that way. We're also going to look at them as a big event. In history, particularly cultural and political history, you tend to see something like a war. Periodically, there's a big event. And then that event not only affects everybody, but it even affects them in the most microscopic aspects of their own lives. So using COVID as an example, you're part of a gigantic trend or event that's happening regionally, nationally, and throughout the world, but also you're seeing it through the eyes and experiencing it through the community and the generations of people who've experienced other ones. Also think of the social and cultural history element when it comes to family history. As John Putnam has experienced, you'll see John later today, he and I are both genealogists. A lot of us in this community are, and naturally study history with genealogy and vice versa. And so when it comes to something like a major epidemic, you see that have an effect on most families one way or another during the time period when it occurs. And so I have some examples that I use just because they're personal one that don't belong to anybody else, so I can use them. But they are interesting as parallels to COVID in the sense of how do we respond to things in our personal lives, in our families, and how do these things become almost legendary in terms of storytelling about family history. So you'll see all of these different aspects of how I'm using COVID to parallel other diseases throughout our local and state history. And slide change, please. Thank you. Okay, we have a heritage of disease fleeing, and that's not fleas as in the ones that might carry disease, but trying to get away from it, trying to find places to go, to health seek. And we live in one of those places. It literally is true that there are some healthier aspects of being here, particularly in terms of respiratory disease, that there might be in some other places. But a lot of that will be also imaginary and fulfilled by advertising. I also mentioned self-inflicting. In other words, during a disease environment, people are often finding cures or ways to avoid the disease altogether that can involve a kind of wounding of oneself, which is controversial too. I wound myself every time there's a vaccine available, but it is an interesting behavior if you think about it and how people have controversy about it. We certainly see that in Colorado Springs. So think also that diseases migrate. They migrate through people and other carriers all over the place. And so they have a history of migration patterns. Also be thinking about how everything is calculated numerically. And when it comes to people struck with a disease, people dying of a disease, we tend to count them. And the larger the count, the more significant the event. It's sort of like if we were counting the casualties in a war, but the war comes and gets you instead of you going out to fight the war. Childhood tragedies are very often part of the emotional side, the sentimental side, the most difficult to handle side of epidemics. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that. I'll mention a couple now just to remind you of how much this is part of our history and literature. I think the first literary childhood tragedy in a family from an epidemic disease that occurs to me is Beth in Little Women, and thinking of how this child just languishes away, and how often throughout our history or our family histories, we find families losing a child. It didn't happen to me. I was an only child, so it didn't happen to me with my siblings that didn't exist. But I grew up with a dad who had almost been one of those and then lost a sister as well. This is not Colorado, but my dad grew up first in Canada and then in Oregon and then in California. And you might imagine the respiratory diseases for him got better the way he moved. But he remembered having to live in one of the treatments that we're going to mention here. It's down on this slide. He had to have an outdoor sleeping porch and an open air school classroom. And so he ended up hating cold the rest of his life. He didn't want to be out in the cold. He didn't want to be poorly covered when he was sleeping. The idea of sleeping outdoors, even in winter weather, was very common during the treatments of particularly our disease in Colorado Springs of tuberculosis. And so you actually see an architectural impact still in the old houses of Colorado Springs, which have porches that seem to be sort of half part of the house and half outdoors, rather than just something to stand on. And these, if they had any enclosure at all, would be perhaps not as cold as my dad had. But you're supposed to sleep out in that air, or you're supposed to go to a school where everyone is in their regular clothing, maybe a warm jacket, but you have the open air of winter. And all of this is supposed to help when you have tuberculosis. My dad never even had tuberculosis. He tested positive for it with a faulty test. So when you think about those situations, and then think about the tragedy that affected each family. In his case, he did survive, obviously, but his older sister then got the Spanish flu when that epidemic came through in Berkeley, California. And so the oldest girl, who I believe was 12 at the time, died tragically young, and her mother mourned her and had her ashes in an urn on the mantelpiece for the rest of her life. So the impact of losing this one child on the whole family was tremendous. And these things are going on as they do in our modern example of COVID in thousands and millions of families. If you go to fads about the treatment, very often it's going to be, in our case, particularly here, the going someplace, the chasing of the cure. Probably the most famous chasing the cure fellow for Colorado was Doc Holliday. Anybody heard of Doc Holliday? When you see any movie about the old outlaw gangs, you tend to see that he's a member who seems to be coughing and ill. And that's because he had tuberculosis. and one of his favorite places to come to try to recover from it was in the Colorado mountains. Or you find people just generally catching on to all the fads I've just mentioned. And one I want to give you here at the bottom of this slide is a nutrition camp. The nutrition camps were a way to try to take the children of tubercular people. And Colorado Springs had a lot of these institutions one way or another. It also was a cause for social working women to take children from tubercular mothers or tubercular environments and try to put them in a situation where they weren't in that environment. And this is even before there really was much understanding of contagion. So they're understanding there's an influence of the environment, but not really medically understanding it. The nutrition camp story that, and perhaps her daughter or grandchildren are out there listening. There is one former student of mine who was a senior citizen when taking my class that told a great story about nutrition camps. And I have permission from the daughter to continue to tell it. So the nutrition camp this young girl was sent to in Colorado Springs was right part of what is now UC Health, what was the hospital that we so often used for so many years in that location, and right next to the Olympic Training Center. And in that vicinity, the nutrition camp was for children of tubercular people to be raised in a healthy manner. And they were treated as though they were sickly or going to be sickly because of this background. The one person I know who told me the story of her experience was that she refused to eat or wouldn't eat adequately. And when they give her a meal, she'd just hide it somewhere rather than eat it, even at the camp. So they kept moving her around, trying to figure out how to manage this. She tried stuffing it down the drains, and in those days, they did not have garbage disposals. She also tried stuffing it when they put her at an outdoor table that had a little flower pot in the center. She'd stuff the food into the flower pot. So as they're trying to take care of her, one of the other stories she told, which I will try to speak about delicately, was that they would check all the children at night before bedtime who are supposed to be lying in their beds to make sure that they had their covers pulled up this far, right, up to their necks, and they had their arms down over the covers. And it seemed very military when she described it to me, but I didn't know the reason for it. And she shared with us that it was because of trying to prevent self-abuse at nighttime. So you have all kinds of interesting treatments and connections and ideas when you investigate this experience that people had. If you want to change the slide, please. No, I'm not going to show you a picture of that, but here's a picture of modern Woodman Sanatorium, and probably the most conspicuous of all because it took up so much acreage. And you can also see the little huts, and I will be mentioning the tuberculosis huts that we used in this area as a way to compromise between living sort of outdoors and indoors at the same time. But modern Woodman is one of many, many. And you can see when I moved here, by the way, some of this building, the chimney, the convent that had moved into the larger facilities, a lot of this was still standing. And I kind of wish there had been a way to keep it all, but that's me, I'm a historian. Next slide, please. Another thing that was popular was not only, this is a version of the little tuberculosis hut, but sort of crossing over between protection from tuberculosis or recovering from it and camping gear. And so it was popular in this area to treat yourself if you were ill or go to a place that would treat you as though you were out camping. And next, please. And you can see the headlines. This is when we go to Spanish influenza. And so again, it's a typical historical event. If you look at the way we treat wars, maybe elections, how a plague of one sort or another is a historical event, and how it affected your family or some individual who lived in, how it affected different places like Colorado, is worthy of historical coverage. But we haven't been as consistent with that in reference to disease epidemics. And obviously they are happening at regular intervals, and in a place like this in particular, where we invite the sufferers to come here to get over it, we see a huge impact every time there's any kind of epidemic. And next slide, please. Always see elements of impact in the military. In the Spanish influenza epidemic, you see, of course, trying to cause people to wear masks, trying to get the men to not spit. And not spitting was not something made as much of when it was tuberculosis, but Spanish flu, by then it was out there as a concern, and it had been sort of developing in tuberculosis days. So in Colorado, in tuberculosis days, laws were passed to prevent spitting on the streets. And spitting was not necessarily the cause, but it certainly could spread either disease. And next, please. And there's some nice World War I era military guys in showing how brave they can be to wear their masks. And masks were controversial, not necessarily in the same ways, but were controversial each time people were told to wear them. And next, please. So here's a study, for example, from how masks were questioned during the 1918, which is Spanish influenza pandemic. And you can see how this one scientist has studied what people believed about masks, and people were reluctant even then to wear them, didn't like to wear them, argued that they didn't do any good. And the medical advice was pretty much similar to what it is now, which is it might do some good, it does some good in some cases, just do it. But we have trouble now too. And next, please. I wanted to show this as one example of the way that local and neighborhood and smaller groups of people in a community like Colorado Springs become involved in an epidemic, and it becomes a marker. It becomes one of the local history events that COVID came to the Bridge Club. And I don't know how many of you might remember this. I imagine a lot of folks who lived here then will remember it. And I don't want to use any names of individuals, but this Bridge Club is quite a popular recreational group in Colorado Springs. One that I actually didn't know that much about, but I knew more about the people in it because they tended to be senior citizens, and I teach classes for an organization called Pillar that probably a lot of you are aware of, and other events like this. And so meet a lot of senior citizens of the community who take such classes. And it turned out that most of the people who became infected in our first outbreak of COVID in our community in this Bridge Club were people I knew, or the next one over was someone I knew. And the first person who died in Colorado Springs from COVID was also of this Bridge Center. So we have interesting social cultural patterns with just that. This is the historic event for Colorado Springs. This is the kind of group COVID might be spreading in when we barely are finding out about it and knowing how to prevent it if possible. It shows all the emotions that a community would have to lose even one person, let alone more, and watch the news for that information, realizing that this might become what spreads across the community. Next, please. And this is my last slide, just to remind you again about the mask controversy. Obviously, we have the Air Force Academy wearing their masks, and most people wear masks, still do, if ordered to by military, by federal employment. At Pikes Peak Community College, we had some controversy about wearing masks. Some definitely had some sort of microcosmic of the larger community. But a lot of us, if I for one, will still wear a mask in the classroom, thinking in terms of general protection. And also maybe thinking historically about it, maybe thinking of my age and how many reports I hear about people from other age groups or in the public bringing the disease. We were all, I think, all organizations more conscious and having more structures to prevent spread of the disease earlier. And now that we think of it sort of as the flu running by us or a seasonal thing and under control, essentially, then it's not so controversial. But here's a controversy. Remember this one, where students at a school in Colorado Springs said that in frustration over the issue, teachers were making the students use something similar to masking tape to wear across the mask to seal it across their faces. It still remains a controversy depending on who you talk to, whether the teachers did that, whether the students did that, and what it all meant, except that it's an example of how controversy and social trends and so many different elements come up during an event like COVID. And next, please. And so here we have on the left, another one of our wonderful TB huts. And these run wonderful in the sense of being sort of an amusing effort to cure tuberculosis, which sort of by happenstance might introduce some good practices, but in other ways was not really a medically sound way to do it. And a building that ends up being popular to go find and buy so you can have it in your backyard or have it as the entrance gate at Rockledge Ranch. So they're an emblem in a way of the community, which is ironically an emblem all about tuberculosis. And on the right, this is not my father in the picture, but this is a classic picture of an open air school to give you an idea of another practice that was common to fight tuberculosis. So what I think I'm doing, and I think that's the last slide, but if you want to check and see for me, just go ahead. There you go. What I'm doing is presenting COVID and relevant disease epidemics in Colorado Springs history as telling us a lot about the history of society's handling of disease environments, cures, and sort of the historic event or period of having a scourge run through a society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. One thing that I'd like to remind everyone about is that we do have the Q&A function and the chat function. If you do have questions, put those in the Q&A function or the chat, and we will revisit them at the very end of after all the speakers have presented. So there is a place for those questions. Moving right along, though, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Pat Musick is a Colorado Springs native and artist. An introduction to calligraphy at Reed College led her to the British Isles for postgraduate research on early Irish manuscripts. She has taught studio art and art appreciation at PPC, UCCS, and CSU Pueblo, and is a former interim director of the West Virginia Folk Life Center and currently serves on the Colorado Springs Historic Preservation Board. She has researched and presented on local artists of the New Deal and their impact nationwide, contributed to the Pioneer Museum's COS at 150 exhibit, and co-founded the organization A New Deal for the New Deal. When not exploring ancient sites or the wilderness, she lives and works in the studio home her artist's parents, built among the Red Rocks. Her presentation is titled The Depression and the New Deal, Regional Resilience and Restoration. Pat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brett. And thank you, Pikes Peak Library District, for putting this symposium together. The stock market crash of 1929 brought the roaring 20s to a screeching halt. In 1929, there were approximately 181 millionaires in Colorado. By 1932, there were 29. Next slide, please. Businesses closed, workers were laid off, banks weren't insured, and so when banks failed, people lost all their savings. Industries stopped production, and so Colorado's mines and that produced metals for industries closed. Several years of severe drought blew the parched topsoil of eastern Colorado's and other farmland all the way to New York. Families lost their homes. Hundreds of thousands became homeless migrants. 1 in 4 men in the state were out of work. Many families went hungry. 24 banks in Colorado closed. The Broadmoor Hotel itself went bankrupt. Next slide. Thanks. Accepting the 1932 presidential nomination, Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed, "I pledge a new deal for the American people, a new order of competence and courage." Even when desperate, most people considered handouts degrading. They wouldn't have felt comfortable with a stimulus check. Many wrote to Roosevelt, "Please, Mr. President, give me a job. I don't want no relief, I want work." Roosevelt's programs, many of which were job creation, both provided income and lifted morale. They returned the taxpayers' money as wages and materials for jobs benefiting the nation's infrastructure, conservation, education, health, culture, and more. This is just a sampling of some of the New Deal programs. In Colorado, twice as much was received in federal funds as was paid to the federal government in taxes. Colorado Springs in 1930 reached about as far east as Hancock Street. Resilience emerged as people found whatever means possible to earn a little or to eat. For example, at one point, an infestation of jackrabbits plagued the east side of town, with rabbits so plentiful they were coming into houses. Richard Merrill recalls a boyhood memory of families heading out east of town, the women driving slowly, the men perched on the hoods of their cars with shotguns, and the children running behind to pick up dead rabbits and toss them in the trunk to turn in for a bounty of 5 cents each. 40 rabbits would get you $2, which was then enough to buy a little gas and food. Art students, Charlie Bunnell and Archie Music traded paintings for food. The picture in the lower right is my father's chicken shack studio, where he boiled up the soup bones he got in trade during the bitterly cold winter of 1932. These are among the many New Deal programs that provided funding, jobs, and a lasting legacy to the Pikes Peak region. You'll see some of their legacy in the following slides. The Civilian Conservation Corps camps performed work ranging from planting trees to building Rampart Range Road and the High Drive, fighting forest fires, and other forestry construction and conservation projects. Young men in the CCC received food, lodging, education, skills, a lifelong sense of accomplishment, and $30 per month, of which they were required to send $25 back to their families. The CCC planted trees and built check dams in Garden of the Gods, check dams along Fountain Creek up Ute Pass, numerous maintenance projects at Glen Cove, as well as a rock climbing demonstration amphitheater in North Cheyenne Canyon, which has been demolished, and model relief maps of Pike National Forest, which have been lost. Three CCC camps were located in Colorado Springs, and one each in Cascade, Fountain, Manitou, Monument, and Woodland Park. Any given camp included both local and non-local young men, no women, In the Pikes Peak region, camps did work for the National Park Service, Soil Conservation Service, Forest Service, and city parks. New Deal programs responded to local needs. The flood of 1935 washed out neighborhoods along Monument Creek and most of Monument Valley Park, including bridges. You see the Bijou Street Bridge on the upper right. The Public Works Administration was a program that provided funding for local projects with a requirement for a percentage of matching funds from the community. The PWA funded 2 bridges to replace those washed out by the flood, including the Mesa Road Bridge over Monument Creek on the lower right. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, also funded local projects, requiring the local community to provide 10 to 15% of the overall budget. The WPA rebuilt the park, including the 2 miles of stream channeling with local stone that still contain the stream. Much of General Palmer's original landscaping of the north part of the park, including lakes, was not replaced. But WPA laborers, under the guidance of master stoneworkers, built pedestrian bridges and an underpass, the Columbia Street entrance, and the Serpentine Wall, most of these recently restored by Friends of Monument Valley Park. The WPA's legacy is visible still in many places in the park. 4 WPA monuments marked by an X on the map on the right, which shows the lower side of the park, can still be seen. In Bancroft Park on West Colorado Avenue, the bandshell built by the WPA still stands. The lake they built is no longer there. The WPA provided Palmer High School to replace the old Colorado Springs High School. Despite the influx of money, job creation, and new building coming into the community through this federal funding, the local newspaper ran scathing editorials against Roosevelt and the New Deal, and wealthy citizens, including Spencer Penrose, despised Roosevelt. Ironically, though the Broadmoor came out of bankruptcy, Penrose accepted WPA funding for lifeguards at the Broadmoor Hotel's pool. Manitou's WPA legacy includes the City Hall addition, Mansions Park, and numerous retaining walls, one of which, lower right, was signed by WPA workers. Manitou experimental forest buildings in Woodland Park, which are still there, were built by the WPA. Recognizing that, as one member of Roosevelt's administration put it, hell, artists have to eat too, the New Deal included funding programs for the arts. The Federal Art Project provided salaries for artists with demonstrated need to create paintings, dioramas, murals, posters, and educational materials. In this case, puppets to enliven the teaching of history and social studies at North Junior High. And these are just a few of the puppets in the Pioneers Museum collection. Lloyd Moylan's mural is one of several painted for local schools by artists in this program. Others, like the one by Charlie Bunnell for West Junior, have been lost. FAP artists produce posters for a wide range of programs and government departments, including national parks, health and safety, arts, music, theater, and later the war effort. The pilot program for art in public buildings was the Public Works of Art project of 1933 to 34, which provided funding for art in civic buildings. Its director called for, quote, a permanent record of the aspirations and achievements of the American people. Artists were to paint the American scene. That's why these New Deal murals have the style that they have. Many of the artists at that time were experimenting with abstraction, but they were given parameters by the government about the kind of art that was intended to uplift the citizenry. Boardman Robinson, director of the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center's art school and the regional director for New Deal public art programs, chose 2 of his students to paint murals for Colorado Springs City Auditorium. The section of fine art funded art in federal buildings, not civic, right? And those were mostly post offices. These commissions were awarded through juried competitions, not necessarily demonstrated need. When some citizens complained about this use of their tax dollars, Manitou Post Office's artist, my father, commented on the small proportion of any one person's tax dollars that went toward a single post office, then the much tinier percentage of that for the art, saying that mural jobs gave, quote, the artist a more solid footing in the social scheme, converting him from a precious parlor monkey to a useful tradesman, so that he may walk on the sidewalk with respectable people. The downtown Colorado Springs Post Office's New Deal murals were removed when the interior was reconfigured. These are now in the Denver Federal Center. Our Fine Arts Center's art school had a major impact nationwide through its students and instructors, whose murals, mostly those painted under New Deal programs, are found all over the country. The Federal Writers Project funded unemployed writers, editors, and researchers. The American Guide series created detailed guidebooks for every state, each with multiple contributors, but most of them were published without bylines. So I haven't yet discovered whether any Pikes Peak region authors contributed to the Colorado Guidebook. The FWP also was involved in collecting and writing down oral histories, including those of formerly enslaved people. So a couple of other programs, young people, men and women, unlike the CCC, were employed through the National Youth Administration. Those in high school could earn $6 a month. Those in college, $15 a month. It was enough to help with shoes and clothes, enabling them to stay in school. The Farm Security Administration's most famous photographs are of farms and rural communities, but an FSA photographer captured this Greek regiment at Camp Carson, now Fort Carson. Not everyone approved of the New Deal. Although local regions specified projects they needed, Pikes Peak area governments disliked federal programs and the small percentage of local funds some required. Spencer Penrose, like many of Roosevelt's wealthy peers, considered him a traitor to his class. That was no doubt partly because during World War I, the tax rate on the highest earners had been 77%. From 1925 to 1931, that tax rate had gone down to 25%. During the New Deal, the tax rate on highest earners went back up to 63%. So of course, Penrose didn't like that chunk taken out of his earnings. By contrast, today, the highest income tax bracket for earnings is 37%, but the corporate tax bracket is 21%. Things were so much in unrest during the 20s, even though there was great prosperity. There were also huge labor wars and a great, the Communist Party was expanding very much because the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum were full of unrest. I heard an interview on radio some years back with a nephew of FDR, who said that Roosevelt was not a traitor to his class. He knew that if he didn't do something to help the people, there would be a revolution. In the 1930s, America was in a depression in both senses, economic and morale. Fear was pervasive, no matter one's economic status. Roosevelt's statement, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," reframed the situation to one of working toward a common goal. From this, together with New Deal jobs creating basic economic stability and a sense of worth, it enabled people's natural resilience to blossom in restoring the Pikes Peak region and community. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Fascinating subject, and I loved the images. I felt like I was walking down Monument Park, looking at things with you. So so really, really very neat. At this point, we will take a 15-minute break. Okay, everyone. I hope you had a relaxing and enjoyable short break. We'll get back together with our presenters. And once again, I can also see that we are getting some question and answers. Some questions are being put in the chat. We will address those at the very end at about 11:45 when we'll bring all the presenters back. But right now, I'm going to introduce our third presenter. Our third presenter is John Putnam. John Putnam is a local insurance and risk professional whose interest in local family and genealogy subjects has involved him in other community historical pursuits. He is originally from Western Massachusetts and grew up in a family that immersed him in local and state history topics. His involvement on the Waldo Canyon Wildfire Recovery Team brings together both his professional background and his firsthand experience of witnessing the recovery and resilience of the Mountain Shadows neighborhood in Colorado Springs. I'm going to turn the controls over to John Putnam for his presentation entitled Colorado Springs Together, a Catalyst to the Waldo Recovery. John?
Thanks, Brett. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my story of resilience, resistance, and restoration that I learned as a result of my activities with the Waldo Canyon fire. So the last time I presented at the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium was 10 years ago. And my topic was historical floods of the Pikes Peak region. Little did I know that within a month, we would have the largest wildfire hit the northwestern part of town in the Mountain Shadows neighborhood. Within 2 days of that event, I got the call from the team leader, which we'll talk about, could I please help them out with the recovery process that we'll discuss in this presentation. So today, it is my intent to start the recovery story of Colorado Springs Together. I say start because it's, because it's current history. There's been a lot of, periodic history. Sometimes you see interviews, but you probably haven't started seeing it all together. And it's my intent here to try to do that, particularly in light of the fact that we're now seeing way more wildfires and other related events, which probably needs to have some better modeling for how to deal with the resilience and recovery of these events. So for those of us who lived in Colorado Springs in the summer of 2012, I'm guessing that some of you either on the news or in real time saw pictures like on the left-hand side. And as I think Kathy mentioned, sometimes we deal with events versus big picture. And certainly the Waldo Canyon fire was an event, which, is not only horrific, but it burned down 347 houses, killed 2 people, damaged a whole bunch more lives, and was a major disruptor for northwestern Colorado Springs for pretty much the next year. The picture on the right is the story that you don't often hear. Sometimes you don't even get to see it, although I'm guessing since we were all here, or many of us were here, you saw some of these pictures. I have to admit, I'm not sure which is a worse looking picture, the one on the left or the right, but it's a picture that we have to deal with just the same. So this fire was very rapid. It burned from about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, probably didn't get down into the neighborhood until about 5. And for all intents and purposes, it was either out or contained, at least in the neighborhood, by 10 o'clock at night. So very quick. And of course, it was driven by horrific winds, and that didn't help things. So it became the largest natural disaster to hit Colorado Springs. On the evening of and the morning thereafter, nobody really knew how much damage had been done yet, because civilians weren't allowed up there and the first responders were still working the issue. But Steve Bach, our mayor at the time, discovered that we had great plans for dealing with natural disaster events, but we had no formal recovery plan. So he made this observation sometime between the end of the fire and 6:30 in the morning, when he gave a call to Bob Cutter by cell phone, asking him to lead a private enterprise recovery of the Waldo Canyon fire. At noon, that was further confirmed with a luncheon, and at that point in time, Bob gave the final yes, and the process started. So you may recall, many of us recall, how chaotic the recovery from Hurricane Katrina was. Fortunately, as Bob started looking at recovery systems, he looked at some FEMA information, and there was really no model out there. There was no recipe for recovery. But he picked up 3 words: communication, coordination, and collaboration, that should be cornerstones of our recovery process. So I think we can all agree that communication is pretty basic and elementary, and it's even more so when you have a disaster. Coordinating, you can't imagine and begin to imagine all the different pieces. This is a big puzzle. The recovery is a big puzzle, and to be able to coordinate all the pieces is a monumental job, not totally within the usual purview of government. And so coordination was a big piece. And then collaboration, collaborating between the parties that could bring solutions to the problem. And then Bob did add, during the course of things, we found out the incredible power of the community. And this was not just the Mountain Shadows neighborhood, but it was the Rock Rimmon area that was immediately surrounding the area, and eventually the whole city and Pikes Peak region that came to play is probably the wrong term, but came to assist in this recovery process. It's a process that for the rest of my days I will never forget. So we were on a fast track. This is a picture of Bob and another picture of the horrific damage that had been done by this fire. And so the day after he met with the mayor, he's meeting with the legal counsel to form the not-for-profit. The next 4 days, he's finding people to serve on the committee. It was a mix of community people, government people, specialized people such as myself. And then on the 3rd, the paperwork was filed with the Secretary of State to form the not-for-profit. And oh, by the way, a week after the event happened, we have a full meeting of everybody on the committee to start processing what we need to do to get things back into order. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You can read this yourself, but basically our mission, bottom line mission, was hugely focused. And the focus was our customers were the affected Mountain Shadows homeowners and any adjacent neighborhoods. And basically, what we were trying to do is bring the resources, and we're not necessarily talking money resources. We're talking about the resources of information and capabilities and so forth and so on to bring solutions and recovery to the Mountain Shadows neighborhood. So if I were to summarize the functions of our team, first and foremost, we were a recovery team. We like to call ourselves type 1. You've heard type 1 when it comes time to fighting fires. We don't usually talk in terms of having a type 1 recovery team, but certainly that was one of the things that we felt was very important. We were customer centric. We worked at the speed of light as much as possible, and we felt that speed was incredibly important to give the neighbors hope and a positive outlook. The importance of communication, we had the mantra of one good piece of information daily, giving it out in small spurts rather than inundating people with lots of information. We think the importance of having a community center, which we'll talk about in a little more detail, was huge. And then last but not least, having a one-stop recovery place where somebody could go and hopefully walk away with answers to their particular problem. What we did not do is we did not disperse financial assistance, any counseling, emergency response, or business recovery. How do we work? Through meetings and through emails. We probably did some virtual. We didn't have Zoom back in those days. But the first 2 months, we met twice weekly, then twice monthly after that for the rest of the first year, and then 3 months. And we were out of business, which was by design, within about 18 months of the event. So it was a very simple process. Bob would set the agenda based upon whatever issues were outstanding. And we would go around the room and we would determine progress, bottlenecks, issues, and then based upon that, we would address them accordingly. And always somebody got assigned to deal with that in some way, shape, or form so that when we left the meeting, we could continue on the process. Where did we do our work? Well, we were lucky to get an opportunity to rent for a short period, for a year's time, basically, the former Blockbusters Recovery Center, which was right in the neighborhood. It was a place where people could go and ask the experts. That's allegedly me because I was there for insurance help, but we had other people. We had SBA, we had Aspen Point, which are other providers of some of the services that I said we didn't provide. We had builders, we had just a whole ream of people to be able to help people. And at the end of the day, it really served as a place where people in the community, the surrounding area, could come together for various kinds of meetings and also subcommittees and things that they were doing. Had a very active communications team. Basically 2 people, but with some staff work. And they built 2 discrete email lists, which allowed them to push out mail to people who needed to have information. So there was one list of people who were the survivors who lost their houses, and there was another more general list. And then they managed all the local press inquiries, as you might imagine. That was a pretty major effort by itself. And then last but not least, we did have a website. So what kinds of issues did we deal with in the timeframes in which we dealt with them? Well, as you might imagine, debris removal was huge. This is Mayor Bach and the white shirt and tie. And I believe that's a homeowner. It was a demo of a debris removal that was done 3 weeks after the fire was out. Community security, developing the website, sandbagging, which I talked about in one of the articles that I wrote in that earlier Symposium book. Getting everybody's contact information was a huge undertaking, particularly in light of all the privacy things surrounding this. And last but not least, finding the community center to work. So don't have a time to go through each one of these things in this short time, but as you can see, the first 60 days were filled with activity, filled with progress. People could see that progress was beginning to happen, and it was really amazing to see how quick things could be up and running. For the remainder of the year, we had some issues surrounding building codes. And it was one of the first times that I had seen in my insurance career the importance of building codes, which has a direct cost impact on the rebuild. And, I worked through that with the various parties that were working with that. Certainly beginning to have some insurance issues. Some of the things that aren't talked about a lot about this is the people who had massive smoke damage in their homes. Ordinance clarification. So besides the building codes, certain neighborhoods had certain requirements for rebuild, which created issues. And then last but not least, coordination between the builders and the insurance companies. The first half of 2013, continuation of the insurance builder coordination, final demolition of a few remaining foundations, planning and executing our first anniversary event, and then wrapping up the business. So this was not something that was going and going and going. It was meant to be very, very precise, very finite for the time period. So what lessons did we learn? And what lessons do we think we can share with other people who are going through the same process, and perhaps even processes similar to what we've gone through with COVID? But the private sector team, by bringing together the community in that format, made things happen faster, more effectively and efficiently, as my couple slides later will show. Amazing to see the impact and the power of the community, recognizing people recover at different speeds, importance of getting out correct and true information. And last but not least, the difficulty, because not all houses burned. There were partial losses, and there were some houses that experienced almost no damage at all, but doing a recovery around them creates an interesting problem. From my standpoint, I was happy to report that there wasn't an awful lot of underinsurance like we're hearing about from Marshall. How quickly, it was amazing. Most people don't have a clue about what they have in their insurance policy until it's necessary to make a claim. And for the most part, most people picked that up very quickly. Recoveries aren't just physical, they're psychological. The public entities worked really incredibly closely with us, and in some instances cut corners, not in a negative way, but in a way to kind of facilitate the whole recovery. And the main thing was to keep everything positive and moving on track, which was incredibly important to our recovery. So here's our report card. Don't have a lot of time to go into detail, but what I want you to see is after 6 months, we had 1 completed home and 78 permits. I point out the usual benchmarks just by point of example. Marshall Fire at this point in time has about 1/3 to 1/2 of their buildings removed, or have the debris removed. They have 11 building permits, and they have no completed homes, and they have 3 times more buildings than we have. So at the end of 2 years, we're about 80% recovered, meaning people have been built and moved back into their homes. So why do I think CST matters? I think it's a huge statement to have seen the synergy that was created between the survivors and the CST team and the public entities for such a quick and complete recovery. The speed and the completeness of our recovery is probably, from best I can tell, probably the best that's ever happened. So I think that's a major testament to not only our area and community, but also to a certain degree, this model that Bob organized and ran during the short period of time that we did this. We think that the private sector model is going to be something that is going to become more important. And then in terms of going forward, we think it's important for the public entities and communities to think in terms of having type 1 recovery teams and leaders to be running this. And why is this all important? Well, depending on your point of view, natural disasters and extreme weather are happening with greater frequency, so we better be prepared. So was CST and the recovery from the Waldo Canyon fire a Phoenix moment? Well, obviously I have, I have an invested interest in this whole thing, but I have never in my life experienced such creativity, collaboration, innovation, and a sense of community that happened after Waldo Canyon, and it'll last with me for my remaining days. So I think it points out to the importance of preparedness and readiness. So, not to simplify things, because there was a great pain, and I'm not here to tell you that everything was perfect, but I'm here to tell you that miraculously, between what the Mountain Shadow neighbors did, the CST's 4 Cs, the public entity support and encouragement, support of all the Pikes Peak region, and to a certain degree, the state beyond, equaled the unprecedented fast, complete, and better recovery of what most wildfire survivors experience. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and look forward to further narrative in my paper that I plan to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. It's really interesting to think that it's almost been a little bit over 10 years, and I've seen a lot of reminiscing and memorization over the last month or so. And this is something that I haven't seen a lot about, is that recovery aspect. So thank you for highlighting that. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about it during the Q&A sections. Our final presenter for the day is William Schultz, and he is an assistant professor of religions in the Americas at the University of Chicago Divinity School. His work focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, and capitalism in modern America. His first book project, Jesus in the Rockies, How Colorado Springs Became the Capital of American Evangelicalism, is under contract with University of North Carolina Press, and it explains the confluence of evangelicalism and capitalism and how it transformed the city of Colorado Springs into the epicenter of conservative Christianity. His presentation today is entitled God's Country, How the Foreclosure Capital of America Became Jesus Springs. William, I'll let you take it away. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Let me just see. All right, just making sure that I am unmuted. Well, thank you so much, Brett, for the introduction. And my thanks to everyone at the Pikes Peak Library District for arranging this wonderful symposium, making it possible. I'm so glad that I could join you, if only virtually, today to talk about resilience and recovery in Colorado Springs. So, as a starting point, if there is something that Colorado Springs is known for nationally, if there's something that people from outside of Colorado know about the city, it is very commonly the presence of so many evangelical Christian institutions in the Springs. There are dozens of such organizations, radio stations, denominational headquarters, publishing companies, ranging in size from employing hundreds of people to one-person organizations run out of somebody's basement. So the goal in my book, and part of what I'm going to talk about today, is the simple question: how did Colorado Springs become, as some people called it, Jesus Springs, or the Evangelical Vatican? Nicknames that were commonly thrown around in the 1990s and 2000s. And what I want to suggest today is that this transformation is not something inevitable. It's not something that came about because Colorado Springs was always a conservative and religious city. At the same time, I don't think it's also quite right to describe it the way some people did at the time as a kind of evangelical takeover of the city. Neither of those narratives is quite right. And what I want to suggest is that if we want to understand how Colorado Springs became quote unquote Jesus Springs, we need to understand the economic shifts that made it possible. And we need to think about this transformation as part of the city's long-running efforts to escape the boom and bust economy that has so long defined the region. And so I want to suggest that this transformation can actually be understood as a story of economic resilience and recovery. It is important to note that there is a longer history of evangelical Christianity in Colorado Springs. It did not just begin in the 1980s and 1990s. The first large evangelical Christian organization, Young Life, which ministers to high school students, arrived in the city in the late 1940s, purchasing Star Ranch and later turning it into their headquarters. A few years later, the Navigators, another large evangelical Christian ministry, relocated from Southern California to Colorado Springs, where they purchased Glen Erie, pictured here, which was the mansion created by William Jackson Palmer, the city's founder. Now, organizations like Young Life and the Navigators found Colorado Springs appealing for a lot of reasons. There was cheap property, the scenery was beautiful, it was a fairly conservative community, so they came for this mix of financial and cultural reasons. But though they were an important part of the community, they were never dominant in any sense. And indeed, for the decades after their arrival, the military, the Department of Defense, retained its position as the economic powerhouse of the Pikes Peak region, thanks to installations like Fort Carson, the Air Force Academy, and so on. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it appeared that this trend would continue, that it would in fact intensify as the militarized space program expanded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A lot of the funding for this program, millions and millions of dollars, flowed into military installations around Colorado Springs, which led some people to hope that the city would become, as the quote had it at the time, aerospace capital of the free world. A city comparable to, say, Houston or San Diego in its military influence. And not surprisingly, local boosters were very enthusiastic about this possibility. They bought up thousands and thousands of acres of land around Colorado Springs in the hope that the aerospace capital of the free world would be a good place to build houses, to recruit businesses. Unfortunately, the military money proved to be less of a sure thing than many of these boosters had hoped. And as the Department of Defense started to make cuts to the military space program in the mid-1980s, those cuts drew blood in Colorado Springs. And a lot of the ambitious plans of real estate developers went up in smoke as the military money drained away. So rather than becoming aerospace capital of the free world, Colorado Springs wound up with a much less positive nickname. It became the foreclosure capital of America due to the number of foreclosures which resulted from this real estate crash. So the local business community cast about in an effort to find a way to fix this problem. And one of the strategies that they hit upon was to try to revive and diversify the local economy by recruiting nonprofit organizations, which they believed would be a little more stable than the military. And for this purpose, the Chamber of Commerce tapped a chamber official named Alice Netto Worrell, pictured here, to do much of that recruiting. And here is where, the importance of an individual becomes noteworthy, because Alice Worrell, who was in charge of this recruiting, was herself a devout evangelical Christian. And she recognized that evangelical Christian organizations might be interested in relocating to Colorado Springs to take advantage of all of this cheap property and cheap labor left behind by the economic crash. And so she drew upon her contacts in the evangelical world to start recruiting Christian organizations. And she very quickly found a great deal of success on that front. To give just one example, the Christian and Missionary Alliance. So this was the headquarters of a religious and evangelical denomination called the Christian and Missionary Alliance, which had for a long time been headquartered in Nyack, New York, but which was being squeezed out of the New York region by high housing costs. And Alice Worrell recognized that what Colorado Springs had to offer was a lot of cheap office space and a lot of cheap houses, exactly what the Christian and Missionary Alliance and other evangelical organizations were looking for, especially organizations located in places like New York City, Southern California, or Chicago, the old heartland of evangelical Christianity in the United States. Worrell lobbied hard to attract organizations like the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And in this effort, she received a boost from the Colorado State Legislature. At the time that Worrell was recruiting evangelical Christians, the Colorado Legislature approved a bill spearheaded by Republican State Senator Terry Considine, pictured here, second from the left. I would say in the cowboy hat, but they all have cowboy hats. So the gentleman on second from the left spearheaded legislation which hugely expanded the tax exemption for religious organizations in Colorado. So this generous tax climate, combined with the cheap office space, with the cheap property, with the low wage labor readily available in the wake of the economic crisis, made Colorado Springs the destination for Christian organizations looking to relocate. The biggest success for Colorado Springs was an organization that many of you may be familiar with, Focus on the Family, a media empire and family counseling operation, which through the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s was perhaps the most influential evangelical Christian organization in the United States. And Focus on the Family had outgrown its original headquarters in Southern California, and it was tempted by Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs offered Focus on the Family the opportunity to build an enormous new headquarters, a headquarters that would befit their ambitious goal of Christianizing the United States and the world. So, enticed by Alice Worrell and by a $4 million grant from the El Pomar Foundation, Focus on the Family moved to Colorado in the early 1990s. And their arrival legitimated the Springs as an evangelical Mecca, as a center for Christian organizations. And throughout the early 1990s, dozens of similar organizations followed the Christian and Missionary Alliance and followed Focus on the Family to Colorado Springs. Organizations like HCJB, a missionary radio station, Every Home for Christ, dedicated to distributing evangelical literature, David C. Cook Publishing, a Christian publishing company, and dozens more. And many of these organizations moved into office space, left vacant as a result of the economic and real estate crisis of the mid-1980s. So you went from foreclosed property to evangelical property. This was the story in a nutshell. So as these organizations arrived, they contributed to a growing evangelical community in the city. They attended local churches like the New Life Church megachurch, pictured here, a house of worship that by the 1990s attracted thousands of congregants each week. People like Ted Haggard, pastor of New Life Church, enthused about the vitality that these newcomers were bringing to Colorado Springs. As Haggard said, God himself is sovereignly moving Christian ministries to Colorado Springs. But it is, I think, very important to note that though an enormous number of Christian ministries arrived in Colorado Springs, the city never became predominantly evangelical. It remained religiously diverse, as well as racially, ethnically, and even politically diverse. And some, though certainly not all, some of the evangelical Christians who arrived in the city or who were emboldened by the arrival of other evangelicals were disturbed by this continuing diversity, by the presence of so many different groups. And so some of these evangelicals went on the offensive against what they saw as unhealthy forces within the city, in particular, the LGBTQ community. This isn't the time or place to talk about Amendment 2 and the struggle over gay rights, which roiled Colorado Springs and Colorado in the early 1990s. But here you can see a couple pieces of literature produced during this conflict over gay rights. And I should note that this material comes from the wonderful, wonderful archives at the Pikes Peak Library District. At the same time, this conservative mobilization sparked a backlash among local progressive and even moderate groups. The LGBTQ community of Colorado Springs was energized by this struggle. Many came out of the closet to fight back against what they saw as a right-wing assault. And so, while the boosters who transformed Colorado Springs into Jesus Springs, people like Alice Worrell, they didn't intend to create cultural conflict. Their goal was to revive and restore the local economy. But these kind of struggles over gay rights indicate that efforts at economic resilience, economic reconstruction can often have unintended and very surprising consequences. So what I've tried to get across in this presentation here is the complex interplay between economic change and cultural conflict. And I've tried to show how complex and contingent this whole process is. But of course, it is a very large and complicated story. So I would ask if you are interested in discussing more about it, or if you have information that you would like to share, experiences you would like to relate, please feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email address right here, wjschultz@uchicago.edu. So thank you again to Brett, to Kara, to everyone at the Library District for making this possible. And thanks as well to all of you for attending, for listening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Will. One thing that I will remark very briefly about is I feel like we could have talked about your presentation for another hour. It's just so much more threads to be pulled, things to be talked about, and that can go for every speaker that is presented today. Everything, that's the beauty of the symposium, is you have a 20-minute time slot, so you got to really hit your high points. But all of these really are much larger discussions. As we are waiting for a couple of the presenters to pop back on, I'll answer a couple quick questions that came through in either the chat or the Q&A. The first question that is a pretty easy one: has this been recorded and will it be available? Yes, it will be. We recorded it and it will be sent out, a link to the recording sometime in the next couple of weeks. We want to make sure that it's edited properly and is ready to go. But this will be this one was recorded, as well as our in-person symposium back in June. So both of those links will be sent out. Another question was, is there a copy of the WPA Colorado Guide at Special Collections here at Pikes Peak Library District? I couldn't find a original copy, but we do have an updated version that was published in the 80s. So yes, we do have a copy, just not the 1941 version. And that's something else that I think Will had touched upon, and I think that all the presenters can probably speak to, is we do here at Pikes Peak Library District have a fantastic local resource with photographs, archival collections, published material, everything like that. So if you haven't been down here to special collections at the Penrose Library, this is a treasure trove of our community's memories. And I would definitely suggest that at some point, we're not just here for the academic researcher, but we're here for the community. So if you haven't been here, definitely take a swing down and talk to us as our staff is here to help in any way possible. On that note, I think those were the couple quick hitters that I got to answer. I've got a list of questions here, and we'll sort of start throwing some questions out there. And I will start with Pat Music. Pat, a couple of the questions that we had one of the questions was about the Gazette's opposition to the New Deal. And the question was, is that reflective of the community at large, or is that more reflective of the more conservative but local elites?
I believe it was more reflective of the conservative side of the community, which the Gazette seems to be consistent with in its editorial policies, even now. One of the statistics I didn't mention was that there were 5,000 WPA projects in Colorado that included 63 schools, 28 dams, 26 sewage disposal plants, 21 airports. So the community at large, to my understanding, embraced and was very, very grateful for the New Deal programs, and thanked Roosevelt profusely, and had jobs where they didn't have jobs before, and could eat where they couldn't eat before. But the editorial policy, then as now, tended to reflect a certain political viewpoint.
Perfect. Thank you, Pat. For William Schultz, I'll segue. This is sort of related as well. Could you characterize the role of the Colorado Springs Gazette in the evangelicalism of the city? The presenter asked, was it support, or the questioner asked if it was supportive, in opposition, or neutral?
Sure. Well, first, I believe that question is from Bill Thomas, who was an enormous help when I was doing my research at the Pikes Peak Library District. So thank you, Bill, not only for that wonderful question, but for all the help, support, and advice you provided. So yeah, the Gazette did play a major role. I would single out two ways it did so. One was that it was often a cheerleader, at least its editorial page was a cheerleader for this kind of conservative activism. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it promoted a very, for lack of a better phrase, Christian libertarian approach to politics. So it was, it celebrated small government, but it also celebrated social conservatism, including anti-gay rights activism. So Dan Griswold, who was at that point the editorial page editor, and especially Chuck Assay, who was the editorial cartoonist. And Brett, I could be wrong, but I think the Special Collections has a big collection of Chuck Assay's cartoons, if people would want to look into that. It is an interesting, even if you radically disagree with his point of view, it is still a really interesting piece of Colorado Springs history.
And to interject really quickly, yeah. You are not wrong. We have, I want to say, about 10,000 of his cartoons that are actually digitized and available online from like the late 1970s until his retirement in 2014. So yes, it's a really cool collection.
Yeah, and just the other really quick thing, Steve Raby, who is the religion journalist at the Gazette at that period, really helps to contribute to this idea of Colorado Springs as an evangelical Vatican by making regular surveys of the evangelical community in the city, publishing those results in the Gazette. So that helps build the sense that Colorado Springs is a distinct community in terms of its evangelical presence. So I hope that goes some way toward answering what's a really excellent and important question.
Fantastic. To change gears a touch, one of the questions that we got for John Putnam was, did the experience that we had here in at Waldo Canyon with the Colorado Springs together, did that impact or influence the recovery effort for the Black Forest fire? I know that that's sort of comparing apples to oranges, but was there anything that Black Forest was able to learn from the efforts from the previous year?
Well, I think that's kind of a secondary thing that we'll be looking at down the road, and part of the reason why I'm trying to get this thing documented, because the answer is yes. We were approached, and we, the remnants of the team, are constantly approached as recently as January from the Marshall Fire about making things happen, and we spend lots of time telling them about this, and for some reason they can't get it off the ground. And most of the reasons why it didn't get off the ground, this is John speaking, in Black Forest and now also in Boulder, is the belief that private enterprise can't solve the problem. In those two situations, the county government here and the county and city governments up in Boulder have decided that no, not-for-profit groups can't be a part of this. And so at some point in time, because we're having more of these things, I think we need to be learning from each other. But going specifically to Black Forest, yeah, there were people, including myself, I spent probably another 200-300 hours of helping people out there as well. There was quite a group in Black Forest, but they never had the place was a crowded place and a part of the fire department, which was under pressure, and the county had paid some other people to be providing insurance advice. And so, make a long story short, unfortunately, I'm not sure that they learned as much as they should have. And I just read a recent article in the Gazette, and I believe they're 59% recovered in terms of completed buildings compared to our 80% after 2 years. And I would argue that probably we're close to 100% now, now that some of the vacant lots have been built. So long answer, but yeah, I think it's a commentary that needs to be looked at. And I think from a historical standpoint, I'm not a historian, but I'm thinking that this is a topic that we're going to need to cope with as we go forward. So I'll shut up, or I could talk all day on this.
I'll follow that up with another question that we received for you, John. Do you have any insights into the current state of the long-term plan for Waldo Canyon open space?
You know, I don't, other than what I read in the newspaper. I think it's important to understand that wildfire has many consequences, not only to people, but also to the natural environment. And what I understand, because I mean, we talk about full speed ahead and, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead type of environment that happened in the Waldo recovery. The same sense existed with getting back the natural area. The problem with that is that the science of the impact of the fire on the area makes some of those efforts not, you have to wait. And so my understanding is that we're about at the end of the time period, and it's just a matter now of beginning to get money, but they need to reconstruct trails that have been badly damaged. There's still some so-called widow makers. Widow makers are trees that can fall down easily. So there's all those things that need to be addressed, but that's best I can do.
It's actually really interesting, because I think that the way you framed that, it's not just recovery, there's also environmental impact. And that's something that I guess I never really made that connection, that the land and the environment has been graphically harmed. And that can take time to build back, to recover itself, and that just takes time. That's fascinating too, from that standpoint.
I think if you, there's one article that I wrote, it's before your time, so maybe you haven't had a chance to read the second article that I did for the disasters book. But we talked about the impact of floods and the impact of the wildfire on the land. And it's pretty amazing. I see Kathy shaking her head. I know she's has been interested in environmental history for a long time. And I think that's a piece that, that's not what I learned in school. Of course, I didn't learn social history, cultural history. But all these pieces they're miraculous to how they all come together. And so it's fascinating to see how people recover. And I don't mean to, make this look more cheery than it is. There's no question that some people are still seriously impacted from that fire. But it's also true that however we did it, we got back a vibrant community, and the magic of the whole thing still amazes me is how we did it with very, very little politics, very little dissension. And I think it speaks highly of community and what we can become if we try and stay away from some of the polemics that we've gotten ourselves into over time. And again, that's John speaking, but it was an amazing thing. So, but no, the natural history, and I'm, even in the genealogy realm, I'm finding out that there's some very interesting environmental impacts that we now recognize, looking back, that my ancestors that came over 400 years ago, Kathy, don't smile, will be, they were completely oblivious to. And so it's just a new area of research opportunities for professors who need to make a bit, living off this thing, and for some of us who find it fascinating to think about it.
Well, and I think that also speaks to the complexity and the interconnectedness of the human experience, whether it's environmental, whether it's cultural, social. I mean, everything. I can't look at myself as just one of those segments. They're all interwoven, and it's just how many pieces contribute to who we are. It's amazing. Sorry for that. I will pull us back together. I know that we got a question for Kathy, and it was something to the fact that I'm going to paraphrase Bill here, that there has been divisive political dimensions that we're currently facing due to the pandemic, mask policies, etc. During your research, and I think you addressed this in the chat, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more in depth. Was this present during earlier pandemics? Have you seen any evidence of it, or is this just a uniquely 2020, unique to our time period?
I don't think it's unique, because hardly anything ever is. But I do think what I've seen so far is parallels drawn often by other people who found an advertisement or something ahead of me, parallels drawn over the mask issue, but it's more that the professionals, the medical professionals, the upper levels of the military toward the lower levels of the military are trying to convince everyone to use masks because it's a good policy in the epidemic that happens. I have not yet found the wave of evidence I'd love to find of resistance in this political venue. I think when I was thinking of asking Mr. Schultz what you think of this, because I moved here in the early 80s and I'm a native San Franciscan, so you already have a way to classify me a bit. And one of the things that struck me as you were addressing your topics was that I've seen, and you are talking about, patterns over several years of conflict in Colorado Springs, competition and conflict, that are sort of between two political perspectives. Certainly you're labeling two, And once you get into other issues, it seems like you could label them multiple ways. So I've seen, for example, the gay community or members of the gay community dealing with their position here before the situation you're talking about, or as it was just beginning. And I've seen many disputes, small, to go to Bill Thomas's question too, small ones like over masking, or lately over teaching CRT, critical race theory. I've seen a series of issues that I would see because I'm not only teaching in the community college, but because we teach many, many students straight out of the high school system. And the high school system includes many educational institutions developed by the evangelical community that moved in or influenced by them. And so we see, and fortunately, my background gives me the ability, hopefully, to bring people together to discuss rather than to have the conflict get worse. But the conflict is there, and it's over masks. It's over what do you teach them in the classroom, and I'm sure that at different times it has been over issues of gay rights too. So that sort of bifurcation that you're talking about is a continuing element of our society in every aspect of life, I think. Yeah, it's all interesting, and I can't fix it. Excuse me. Excuse me for having to clear my throat, but it's fascinating to see every response that we're getting in this symposium, Brett, to these varied issues all interlocking. It's amazing. Save the comments, they're good.
Well, I'll throw out another question, sort of a question comment to Will. One of the things that I was thinking about when you're presenting has been, we've seen an exodus of some of those same evangelical organizations that came here 20, 30, 40 years ago, have been leaving to go to Columbus, Ohio, or other places where they don't have as high of cost of living. And that just sort of struck me as you were talking about that, was that we're almost at the other side of this circle, where now people are leaving, and organizations that came here for the capitalism, the foreclosure, the lower cost of living, they're looking for new places to sort of resettle their groups. I don't actually know if I have a question, if it was just more of a comment that this is interesting and it's making me think.
I would just say, yeah, that's absolutely true. Christianity Today did a story a couple months back about the Christian and Missionary Alliance, which I talked about in my my presentation, are in the process of moving, or I believe have moved, as he said, to Ohio. So I guess sort of two things there is, I don't want to be too crude or reductionist about it, but a lot of these organizations, in addition to being religious in nature, are businesses, and they have to pay their bills like any other business does. And so as much as they might want to be in a godly community, like, they're also really looking out for cheap property. And we need to be able to hire people, and so we need to be in a place where people can buy houses to live. That's part of the factor. And there's also, the evangelical world is very, it goes in waves. There are a few organizations which remain at the top for any length of time. Focus on the Family is still quite large, but it is nowhere near the size and influence of it was back in the 1990s. And just a real quick thing on Kathy's point, one of the things that most impressed me about the history of Colorado Springs is, in the 1990s, the efforts that some people, including many evangelicals, made to try to bridge these divides and to try to sit down in conversation with people that they really disagreed with. There was this whole movement called dialogue dinners and food for thought that Citizens Project organized, and that a lot of other churches, businesses, ministries were involved in. I don't want to be overly optimistic and just say, oh, we can all just sit down and resolve our differences over coffee. Like, most conflicts are much more deep-seated than that. But there is, I think, value in this kind of conversation. So if Colorado Springs embodies this kind of cultural warfare, there's also these moments of cultural conversation. And those are both, I think, important parts of the city's history.
Fantastic discussion, everyone. At this point, we're a touch over noon. So that 15-minute Q&A turned into almost 20. I think that we've had a really interesting couple threads that have gone through here. On that note, I want to thank all of our presenters for stepping in and presenting today. I know you could be anywhere today, and you have chosen to be here with us. So that's saying something. And I also want to thank our audience that this is the same thing can be said of you. You could be anywhere. You could be mowing your lawn. You could be reading a book. You could be in Bermuda for, celebrating something. And you have chosen to be here with us learning about our region. That's pretty cool. So on that note, I hope you have an enjoyable rest of your Saturday. And come down and visit us down here at Special Collections at Penrose Library. Learn more about our region. Talk to you all soon, and thank you very much.